have no problem. It was God that died on the cross. Why do you have a problem with that?
Because if God died, that's blasphemy. Then who would run the world? Because if God died, that's blasphemy. Then who would run the world?
Because if God died, that's blasphemy. Then who would run the world?
Jesus of Nazareth, you are charged with blasphemy. Are you the Son of God? I am.
The high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. You have said so, Jesus replied. But I say to all of you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? He is worthy of death, they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you?
Did Jesus claim to be God or not? Well, the first thing we have to look at are what are the reliable sources regarding Jesus' life. What sources do we have that we can look at which are relatively reliable? I'm going to quote a scholar for you. This is one that a lot of my Muslim friends enjoy quoting. His name is Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman was my professor when I studied at UNC, and he is well known as someone who challenges the traditional Christian claims. Bart Ehrman has said that if you want to study the historical Jesus, you have to go to the 4 canonical Gospels. You have to. There's nowhere else to turn that comes remotely close. Why does he say that? Because the 4 canonical Gospels are the earliest records of Jesus' life. It'd be like going to taking an interview if there was a traffic accident and you go to talk to people who were at the scene of the accident immediately, right after the accident happened. What happened? Tell me what happened. Who hit who was driving, what was going on, give me the details. Or waiting 4 months, calling those very same people in and saying, what happened 4 months ago at that traffic accident? Who hit who? Tell me what happened. Of course, the more reliable stories are the ones that are taken immediately. The earliest ones are better. We all know this. And there is no gospel that comes anywhere close, or no account of Jesus' life that comes anywhere close to the historical proximity as the 4 Gospels. We can talk about the dating of the Gospels if you'd like during the Q&A session. I'm going to give you the critical datings of the Gospel. I'm not going to give you the Christian datings. I'm going to give you the critical datings of the Gospels. Mark's Gospel comes first, approximately 70 AD. Matthew and Luke come next, approximately 80 to 90. 80, 85 is Matthew, 85 to 90 is Luke. And then John's Gospel comes last, 90 to 100 AD. Now, hear me, I don't agree with these dates. I think that they're very tenuous. I don't think we can actually defend them, but critical scholars use those dates, so I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and go with those dates. If we go with Mark's Gospel being written at 70 AD, that is just 40 years away from Jesus, 4 decades. Still in the lifetime of many people who were alive at Jesus' time. Jesus, if people were 20 years old while Jesus is around, they're 60 by the time Mark's Gospel is around. And we know people lived to a ripe old age at that time. Yes, many died early, but many also lived to a ripe old age. We know Polycarp, for example, who was contemporary to that time, lived into his hundreds, or was it 90s? He lived till he was very old. And John the Elder lived till he was very old, died in Turkey. So we have people who are alive at this time. Well, what did they say? Now, generally speaking, when we turn to the 4 Gospels, historical Jesus scholars are going to leave out John's Gospel. They're going to say, we're not going to look at John's Gospel. And why is that? Because it's the last of the 4, and it looks different from the other 4. It looks fairly different, and I'll agree to that. So historical Jesus scholars don't generally look at John's Gospel. Now, I think that's a mistake. I think there's good reason to think it came early, and for those of you who are looking for a defense of the early dating of John's Gospel, please take a look at Dan Wallace's work. He argues that John's Gospel, based on the grammar found in John's Gospel, is written somewhere in the 50s or 60s. He has good reasons to believe that, and he's not just your run-of-the-mill grammarian. He is the go-to man on Greek grammar. He's the one who's written the best-selling books on Greek syntax. So he believes we can be pretty certain, or fairly certain, that John's Gospel is written in the 50s or 60s. So I'm not agreeing that we should put John's Gospel aside, but for the sake of fair investigation, to have common ground here, let's put John's Gospel aside for a moment. And let's go to the Synoptic Gospels. In fact, to be really fair, why not just go to Mark's Gospel, the earliest of the four Gospels, to see if Jesus claims to be God? Because I would argue, as I did as a Muslim, that if Jesus truly claimed to be God, we would see it in the first of the four Gospels. We wouldn't have to wait till John's Gospel. We'd see it in the first. So what does Mark's Gospel have to say about Jesus? I'm going to distill it for you. Every time Jesus is asked who he is in a public setting, or every time someone says to Jesus, "This is who you are," in a public setting, Jesus has a response. Don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone. Even when Peter, his disciple, in Mark chapter 8 says who Jesus is, Jesus says, "Don't tell anyone." There's only one place in the entire Gospel of Mark that Jesus comes out and boldly proclaims who he is. Are you with me so far? Let me see some nods. Good. And not this kind of nod. Okay. There's only one place in Mark's Gospel where Jesus says clearly who he is. Now, up until then, he's been using a title for himself quite regularly. What is that title? Son of Man. Over 80 times in the Gospels, Jesus uses the term Son of Man. The first time it's found is in Mark chapter 2, verse 10. The next time it's found is Mark chapter 2, verse 24. Throughout Mark's Gospel, Son of Man is the one where Jesus uses the title to refer to himself frequently. Now, there are two sons of men in the Old Testament. One found in Ezekiel and one found in the book of Daniel. Okay, these are two very different sons of men. The Son of Man in the book of Ezekiel is a lowly human figure. God refers to Ezekiel in the vocative every time, calling him the Son of Man. Son of Man do this, Son of Man do that. And it's to emphasize how human Ezekiel is. But then there's a Son of Man in the book of Daniel, which looks very, very different. This is a Son of Man who comes on the clouds of heaven. What does that mean? The only being that comes on the clouds of heaven in the Old Testament is a divine being. In fact, God comes on the clouds of heaven in the Old Testament. So here in the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verse 13, you have one who looks like a Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Very different Son of Man. Which one is Jesus claiming to be? Well, like I said, there's one place in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus boldly, loudly, publicly, clearly proclaims who he is. And that's Mark chapter 14, verse 62. In Mark chapter 14, verse 62, Jesus has been asked by the high priest, who is he? Who is he? Up until this point, he hasn't been saying. This is known as the climax of Mark's gospel. This is what everything has been building to. This question, Jesus, who are you? And Jesus responds, the question is, who are you? Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus responds, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. You will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. So which Son of Man is Jesus referring to? I can hear you. Daniel. He's referring to the one in Daniel, the Son of Man who comes to the clouds of heaven. That's the one he's been talking about. Let's revisit Daniel and see what the Son of Man is about. Daniel is looking at his vision. He's having a vision, and he sees God, the Father, the Ancient of Days, being worshipped on a throne. So this is God, the Father, being worshipped on a throne, surrounded by angels. And then Daniel says something very interesting. He says, behold, verse 13, chapter 7, behold, I look in my night visions, and one like a Son of Man approached the Ancient of Days. So here's God the Father, the Ancient of Days, being worshipped by angels. One like a Son of Man came on the clouds of heaven. As only God and divine being comes, the Son of Man comes on the clouds of heaven. And to him, that Son of Man, is given glory, authority, and sovereign power. Okay, so whoever this Son of Man is, it looks like a Son of Man according to Daniel. He's given glory, authority, and sovereign power. He's coming as a God into heaven. He's given glory, authority, and sovereign power in heaven. Then it says, people of every nation and language served him. Stop. Who is the one who receives service in heaven? God. Well, you might ask, Nabil, what kind of service is this? Maybe it's some other kind of service. I don't know, maybe there's tables, restaurant tables in heaven. We're all going to get served, right? What is this service? This service, according to the Bible, over 130 times this word is used in the Septuagint in the Greek New Testament. It's the word latruo. Every single time this word service is used, it's used as a word due only to God. Due only to God. No human ever receives latruo. Actually, one time a human does receive latruo, and God curses that. He says, essentially, that is due to me. You are cursed for having received latruo. And yet here, the one who looks like a son of man, who has glory, authority, and sovereign power in heaven, came as God comes, is being served in heaven with the service due only to God by all people of every nation and language. And then it says his kingdom is one that will not pass away, and his dominion will never be destroyed. Wait a minute. Stop. In the Old Testament, you've got God being worshipped in heaven, and then you have one who looks like a son of man being worshipped in heaven with the service due only to God in his own kingdom. No one tell me that there's no foreshadow of the Trinity in the Old Testament. It actually starts in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, but it's clearly found here as well. And as if Jesus needed to make his point any clearer, he then says, you will see him sitting at the right hand of the power. That Son of Man will be sitting at the right hand of the power. Well, what is this? This is a reference to Psalm 110, verse 1. In Psalm 110, verse 1, it says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, and I will make the enemies a footstool for your feet. No one in all of Second Temple Jewish history ever claimed the right to sit next to God on his throne. Not only did no one ever claim it for themselves, no one claimed it for anyone else. Because if you were to say that, then essentially what you're saying is that God has an heir. It's like the king sitting on his throne with his son, the prince, next to him. That's what it means to sit next to God in that context. That's why Moses was never shown sitting next to God. That's why Enoch was never shown sitting next to God. Or any of the archangels. They were all shown standing next to God. Sitting next to God would be blasphemy. That would mean that they are God. Yet Jesus claims not only to be the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, whose worship with the service due only to God, but also has the right to sit next to God on the throne. He's the heir to the throne of God. Is it any surprise then why the high priests in this Inquisition opened up their robes and said, you have heard the blasphemy for himself. What shall we do? And everyone responds, crucify him. What was blasphemy at that time? Again, I'm going to defer to Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman says that it's not blasphemy to claim to be a Messiah. It's not blasphemy to tell people they're wrong. It's blasphemy to claim prerogatives due only to God. And that's what Jesus claimed. That's why he was found guilty for blasphemy. That's why he was crucified. By the way, this claim from Psalm 110, verse 1, is it historically sound? Now, I use Mark Gospel, but I don't want to make it sound like the Bible says it, therefore it's true. Historical Jesus scholars take a look at the term Son of Man, and they say that the term Son of Man fulfills the most stringent criteria of historical investigation. And what's that criteria called? It's called the criterion of double dissimilarity. This criterion of the historical method is so selective that once it fulfills that, scholars conclude this must have been said. And I can answer questions exactly on how that works if you'd like during the Q&A. That's how strong it is, the Son of Man claim by Jesus. And what about the one that says Jesus was sitting at the right hand of the power? How strong is that? This is the Old Testament reference that's used the most in the New Testament. Over 20 times it's found in the New Testament. It permeates all sorts of letters. It permeates the Gospels. It's found by multiple authors in the New Testament. It is so woven into early Christian history, we can't deny that it's at the earliest stratum. So did Jesus claim to be God? Once again, I argue that we can't ever claim certainty in these matters, but if we're going to say, what's the historically most responsible and by far most responsible conclusion? I would say yes. The evidence points to the fact, even in the earliest gospel, interwoven through all the gospels, verified by the strongest criterion of historical investigation, Jesus claimed to be God. And I realize this as a Muslim, by the way. I'm not saying this to you as a Christian having done the investigation. I was one who was still reciting the 5 daily prayers. I was one who was leading the Jummah. I was giving the Jummah khutbah. Whenever the Imam was gone, whenever my father wasn't around, I would do the Jummah khutbah, the Friday sermon at the mosque. I was the one who would do tafsir on the hadith when we had no tafsir present, commentary. My friends would bring to me hadith. They'd say, Nabil, what does this mean? They would come to me. And I would be the one doing this as best I could. Of course, Allah knew best is what I would say. But that's as best as I could do because they were coming to me. And yet I concluded, if I'm going to be responsible here, history points to the death, resurrection, and deity of Jesus Christ. He's proved his case. Now what about Islam? Remember, these are two separate things. Now Islam does deny those things. Islam does deny Jesus died on the cross, yet it's the most historically responsible conclusion. Islam does deny the deity of Jesus Christ, but once again, it's the most historically responsible conclusion. So already, before getting off the ground, when we take a look at Islam, which comes 600 years after Jesus, 600 miles away from Jesus, what it says about Jesus is not historically sound. Could it still be true? Of course, it could still be true, but we'd have to throw out history in order for it to be true. And if we're willing to throw out the evidence, then anything could be true.